coming up on the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast.
But what I found now, Brian, over exercising is different for everybody, right?
Sure.
But it can basically be just you doing an hour of hardcore every day of the week, just about, or 6 days, 5 days a week, right? There's no area of basically rest in those days. It's just these big, long workouts. So I've found for myself that if I, basically work out, two times a week, pretty heavy on weights, and this is only for like 45 minutes to an hour, and then maybe get in one cardio for like 45 minutes, 35 minutes, something like that really pushes my cardiopulmonary. That's it for me. Like I've noticed, all the other stressors that I do, with the cold plunge or sauna, right? That's enough, right? And work, we always have to evaluate that, right? How much work stress, how much everything, family stress do we have? But that's what I find works good for me, is very minimal. Like that's basically 3 workouts a week of 45 minutes or so,
Hello, and welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I'm Brian Grin, and I'm here to give you actionable tips to get your body back to what it once was 5, 10, even 15 years ago. Each week, I'll give you an in-depth interview with a health expert from around the world to cut through the fluff and get you long-term sustainable results. This week, I interviewed functional diagnostic practitioner Dustin McFarland. Dustin explains his health journey from going vegan to an omnivore and his experience as a natural bodybuilder, along with the importance of managing blood sugar, ways to improve gut health, problems with modern wheat, Dustin's daily routine, and his one tip to get your body back to what it once was. Really enjoyed my interview with Dustin. I know you will too. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the show. All right, welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. My name is Brian Grin, and I have Dustin McFarland on. Welcome to the show.
Hey, I am so excited to be here, Brian. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Dustin. And we've gotten to know each other over the last, I'd say, month. He's been helping me out with my functional diagnostic nutrition certification. So we've gotten to know each other, and we thought it'd be great to have you on and learn about your story. And speaking of that, I was reading a little bit about it, and you've gotten into bodybuilding and things like that. So what sort of led you down the path of health and becoming a practitioner?
It definitely started, pretty young, right? Just having health issues myself. That was really the big thing. And then after, having health issues, I ended up, even during having health issues, I did get into, fitness and, like you had said, bodybuilding. But, I think it really started super young for me, just, coming basically into this world C-section. So that was kind of the first hit to the microbiome. Right. And then, and that was kind of forced, my mom didn't choose that, but that was forced. And then, I did get breastfed well. So that was awesome. So that helped, I think set me up a little bit, but then, the immune system was never right. It was like ear infection after ear infection, tonsillitis, adenoids eventually removed, tonsils removed, tubes in my ears, all these things. And then, it led down that path of just constant antibiotics, right? Just sick all the time. And so then the microbiome takes even that much more of a hit. So anyhow, that was kind of the start of it. And then, what was interesting is that I ended up basically learning, that we're the only species, right, that drinks dairy. And I basically had all of these episodes where I was debilitated on the toilet of not being able to even get out to school. I just couldn't get up. I mean, I was in so much cramping and so much pain. And I had learned that dairy was we're the only species that eats, another species' milk after we're weaned. Right. And so it was like, I'm going to try this thing. Well, I did. And I went dairy free. And you know what? That really, propelled me into this health realm, because when I started feeling so much better by eliminating one food, I kind of knew the power of diet even more than I ever had, because, when I was bodybuilding, diet's everything. Right. But it was more about like, diet was, hey, eat more whey protein shakes and eat more eggs and eat more, lean chicken breast. It wasn't about, the quality, right? As much as I wanted to, that's what it kind of, propelled me of like, wow, if one food can do that, what can happen if we really start to study nutrition. So that's really what got me into it. And I never could learn enough. I mean, it was always, I wanted to take my health to the next level. And so here I am, right? Finally, finding a system, of functional diagnostic nutrition to bring every piece together, just really, seeing every elastic, bit of the body. Basically, we call that the big picture, or the 30,000 foot view. So that's kind of what brought me here.
And talk a little bit about, I mean, you getting into bodybuilding. I was reading, did you become a vegetarian, a vegan, and what was sort of your experience with that?
Yeah, that's actually quite the can of worms, right? But so during the bodybuilding, big years, right? I was certainly eating, animal protein, and that was fine. I mean, I was able to gain, lots of muscle mass, and I was in 2001, I was second place Mr. Idaho. So I was definitely put on, a fair amount of muscle mass, and the what ended up basically moving me towards a vegan vegetarian was I had done a certification. You may have seen in my credentials, right? The certified nutrition consultant. Also, that particular schooling that I had went to was really pro veganism and pro vegetarian. And I didn't know that at the time of signing up, but basically as I was studying their material, I was like, wow, I really should do this. And you know what? Yeah, I really do want my health to go to the next level. I mean, we're always like, more is better, right? I mean, especially, the years that I had personal training background, it was always like more is better, especially when it came to exercise too. But anyhow, so I tried that out, and that absolutely destroyed me. I mean, in 2 years, I was completely wrecked. I had lost a lot of muscle mass. I had basically lost my mental, like in a lot of ways. I was having way more difficulty time maintaining a good mood. I mean, it was so much easier to be depressed and be anxious and all of that. And it took me a long time to recover from that. I mean, the muscle came back relatively quickly, I would say, or at least most of it. The mood and the mental part of it, all the lack of neurotransmitters and amino acids through the liver and everything took quite a while to come back. I was getting sick all the time. Amino acids are everything to our immune system and our ability to detoxificate. And guess what? When you're a vegan or vegetarian, you might be thinking you're getting those in, because I was taking in a lot of raw plant-based protein shakes, but you really aren't, because those proteins are difficult to absorb. They're just, the lectins and the prolamins, right, are just hard to break down. Your body can't cleave those amino acids like it should. So anyhow, yeah, that was an interesting time.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talk about on this podcast a lot about like self-experimentation. And so like, that's quite the experiment. So you were 2 years on a vegan vegetarian diet and sort of saw that like decline in your health. And it's interesting because some people who maybe come from a standard American diet, then they go into a vegetarian or a vegan diet and like their health gets better. So, it's interesting. It also depends on where you're coming from. And some people, like, as you've probably talked about with FDN, is some people can tolerate certain types of diets more than others.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I did feel, and that, I think that you brought up a good point there, Brian, is I did feel better initially. So it was like, whoa, this is the right way to go. But I think a lot of people feel that way initially because, number one, I wasn't coming from the standard American diet, but if you do, you're going to definitely feel that impact. But I do think your body, uses that time to maybe, detoxify a little bit more, maybe, right, or something, initially, but long term, it ends up becoming a problem. And here's one thought I had, right, is while I was doing it, I was like, you know what? Now I'm starting to feel bad. I'm not feeling very good anymore. So you know what? I guess it's just because I'm not taking in the most amazing superfoods. So I started ordering all of these excellent berries and, nuts and seeds from different countries and all this weird stuff, right? The best high quality, cacao bean or whatever it was. And then that wasn't even enough then, right? It was like, I'm still not right. So guess what? I ended up doing a raw food, a vegan, for like the last year of it. And oh my goodness, Brian, talk about pack myself full of oxalic acid like you've never seen. I was in a mess. And, functional lab testing showed me that oxalic acid had absolutely, basically literally shredded my life, right? Those glass crystals are going to basically tear your brain, tear your gut up, tear your joints. And, with those green drinks I was doing, cause I had to, right? The raw food, right? All the nuts and seeds raw, it was a disaster for sure.
Yeah, and so obviously that lasted for a couple of years, and then you sort of came out of that sort of rebuilding process. Did you just start introducing animal proteins again, and what was that process like?
I actually did. To be quite honest, I got hired as a nutrition health coach at a health food store, and they just weren't into the vegan vegetarian, and so they were really glad to see that if I was going to take this position, that I was really leaning towards that paleo approach at that point. And so that was really what it was about, is just actually eliminating a lot of these things that I had needed, right, on those the vegetarian vegan diet, which was like the beans and the grains, right? Those were a big part in the paleo approach. And so I started gaining back health, once I did. But man, it was a slow process. I would say, Brian, that it took at least 10 years to recover
Really?
from a 2-year experiment, just to finally get, mood back, a full muscle back, energy back, immune system back. I mean, there was so much loss that I experienced during that stint. And it probably didn't help. Okay, let me give this too. It probably didn't help the fact that I was still over exercising, right? So I was climbing thousands of vertical feet on my bike a year, getting hundreds of thousands of vertical feet, getting thousands of miles ridden, right? And then on top of that, still training like a bodybuilder. So, on a vegan diet, right? So I'm sure that was probably the reason why I wrecked myself so bad that another person may not experience at all, in 2 years.
So getting your health back now, what are some of the things that you've learned other than not doing vegetarian and vegan diets? What are some of the things that you've learned that you apply like to yourself and then with your clients?
Probably the biggest thing, and this is something that I feel like is something that wasn't taught, of course, in my initial course, but also a lot of Americans don't understand, is really understanding blood sugar and how much that's going to affect your life. I mean, you cannot have a healthy life without it. We now understand that the medical community is calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, right? So that just shows you how devastating it is. Like if your mind's going to go, completely. But that's probably the biggest thing, Brian, is making sure that, like, one of the, and this is what works for me, and I know a lot of my clients, is that making sure the first thing that really touches your lips in the morning is some type of high quality protein, high quality fat. If you don't, right, you end up a lot of times, getting into, a blood sugar roller coaster throughout the rest of the day. I mean, you can basically, if coffee is going to be the first thing that hits your lips, there's a good chance that coffee spiked your spiked your blood sugar, and then cortisol is typically followed by a spike in blood sugar. And so anyhow, we can end up basically on this roller coaster throughout the rest of the day. But that's the main thing I've learned, is like, hey, we've got to somehow figure out a way to make sure our blood sugar is spot on. And that's going to be through, you can do prick testing, if you're into, the Bluetooth signal, all that, you can do the CGM, type of thing, right? All of that. But we've got to figure that out. We got to understand that. And, whether you go clear into the whole, I'm going to go ketosis for a while, right? Get into ketones or not. But I would say that's the main thing, Brian, is let's get our blood sugar balanced.
And what type of things, like I know with FDN, it's we do a GI map and we get into gut health, and I know that you've already talked a little bit about that, but that can be sort of a rabbit hole a little bit, getting into gut health. But what type of things do you work on just to sort of improve gut health and help your clients with that?
Yeah, you bet. I think that's a really good question, because so many people have different opinions and different thoughts about, what to do with gut health.
Right.
But, like I was telling you with the dairy, that is really, I think, one of the key things that we need to understand is what are those foods that are causing major inflammation in our lives. And one of those that we could go on probably for the rest of the talk about, right, is gluten and how problematic that is. But that also ties into another thing too, is that if you take in a lot of gluten, you are likely to spike your blood sugar way more than actual sugar because of the amyloid pectin in there. But so blood sugar, we know, is also one of those things that doesn't help the gut heal and seal, right? As if you have high blood sugar, you're going to typically have a more damaged gut. And so the first thing I would do, definitely, Brian, and I do it with my clients also, is to eliminate wheat out of the diet. This traditional wheat that we have, or the standard American wheat, has been hybridized dramatically, right? So our body doesn't quite know what to do with it any longer. But the other thing about it is that they are currently using on non-organic wheat and other grains, right, and other bean crops. They're using glyphosate, which is, Roundup, right, the nastiest, chemical to actually dry out the, crops, right, to be a desiccant on the crops. And so anyhow, if you spray the crops right after, or right as they're basically ready to be harvested, on to dry them out, right, you've got now this gluten that's going to make the gut more inflamed, more sensitive. But they have proven over and over that the glyphosate is also potentially worse, right, than gluten, as far as opening up that gut barrier and damaging the gut, causing that more inflammatory state in the gut. So if we can do that first, Ryan, I think that's kind of our big key. Yes, we can add in all types of foods that are going to feed the microbiome. We definitely need that, right? We've got these high inulin foods. One of the probably best out there, right, is sunchoke, or also known as Jerusalem artichoke. For your listeners, it does have a nickname as fartichoke because it does create so much gas from the microbiome living on it and loving on it, right? But anyhow, we can do that. I think probably a lot of your listeners, right, super educated, have heard the whole like 5 R's, 4 R's, whatever. But typically, regardless of how many R's you have of this whole, remove and re-inoculate and restore and replenish and all this, it's always typically the remove, right? First and foremost, we got to remove those inflammatory foods and those inflammatory chemicals. And then, like what you and I do, Brian, with the GI map, is we're looking at removing those pathogens, right? Or those bad, bugs, those bad invaders, or the overgrowth dysbiotic bugs. So anyhow, I would say that that's always the big goal first, is let's remove.
Yeah. You hear that, like, a lot of people sometimes go carnivore and they end up getting all this relief. And I think a lot of that's just the fact that it's like the ultimate elimination diet, where they're getting rid of a lot of these gut stressors that have hampered them down through the years.
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right. And, I think the other thing too is that what I've seen is that some of the carnivore community at one time, right, has also tried, like I did, the vegan and vegetarian way. And there's so many of those plant toxins, right, that I just talked about, whether it was lectins or whether it was oxalates, right? These things are also being removed, and therefore, again, so gut health for sure.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know. You're not a full-on carnivore, I'm assuming now, but
No.
I think a healthy individual with a healthy gut should be able to tolerate different foods and not necessarily be carnivore for the rest of their lives. And you're seeing this with a lot of like people in that space, is they'll maybe start with just meat, and then they maybe start introducing other, maybe less toxic foods. I mean, obviously fruit, and even just bringing back some vegetables. Obviously, cooked vegetables would be probably a little bit easier to tolerate than eating just raw vegetables and things like that.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so much easier on the gut. And the other thing too is that, a lot of times you can reduce or, change those plant toxins. Right. So even like the cruciferous vegetable family, that I would stuff mounds and mounds of kale into a blender, right, and blend it up, right? You have this goiterogenic activity that's inhibiting your ability to absorb iodine, right? So like you were saying, if you cook things just like this cruciferous, you're going to be easier on your gut, again, by kind of reducing or restructuring those plant toxins, just like some of the oxalates leave also in certain boiling methods or whatever, right?
And what is your eating schedule like? And I'm always curious. We talk about different routines on this podcast. I like to hear people's routines, maybe your morning and your evening routines and things like that. I know you're a little bit into the biohacking side of things, so I'm curious to know, like, what's your morning routine like in a typical day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely one of my favorite things as far as like routine goes is to, understand, number one, that I can't typically go forever and ever, and I'm getting better, but I can't go forever and ever fasting. I've certainly done my stints of, intermittent fasting. I've done, long fasts and so forth, but the blood sugar management I understand quite well, and I just want to make sure that I don't ever get to that point. But with that morning routine, one of the things that I really like to do, Brian, is get into the cold plunge. I also like to get into the sauna, and those things just feel better fasted, right? So I do like to do those things early in the morning when I'm fasted, but I understand that I don't push myself hours and hours and hours, whatever. But after that, I do always make sure, right, that morning routine includes some type of a high protein meal, right? So anyhow, and then same thing for lunch. I typically, do some type of a high protein for lunch. And what I found is my sleep is much better if I do carbohydrates for dinner, a little bit heavier on the carbohydrates. But what was interesting is that if there was ever any sugar involved in that, it didn't matter if it was fruit or I put a little bit of honey on something or whatever, my sleep was not good at all. So again, I think back to this blood sugar thing, and a lot of individuals do deal with, Brian, this is what our clients, deal with, is these blood sugar spikes and cortisol spikes throughout the night that don't keep, or basically keep them, not sleeping as well or whatever. And so that's kind of what I found for me, is if I focus heavier protein lunch and breakfast, and a little heavier on the carbs, at dinner, then, I just sleep better and have a much better, blood sugar management, especially without the sugar.
And so when you're implementing carbs, are you doing like vegetables and maybe some starches?
You got it. Yep, absolutely. And one of the things that I ended up doing a little bit as I was trying to rid myself of oxalic acid, of course, in the paleo world, we were always taught, like, sweet potatoes and yams are our lifesaver, right? For like carbohydrates from a natural source. Mm-hmm. And so if you can't do fruit, but you do sweet potato, well, the only downside, right, was those are high in oxalic acid. So when I was trying to lower my levels of oxalic acid, yes, we have to address yeast in the gut, and those are some things, right? Mold in your environment or your body, of course, but when you're actually trying to eat low oxalate foods, like I was, I ended up finding myself doing a little more white rice, and I didn't have, the blood sugar spikes from that, but I was able to do some white rice in the evening and then also some vegetables, and that seemed to be good, especially if it was covered in quite a bit of fat, right? Mix it in with some fat, but yeah, and so yeah, it's the oxalates are a challenge to get out. They don't come out easy, and when they do, they're painful. So we do want to be really careful with just going overboard, especially if we have a tendency to have gut issues, which makes that a little bit more problematic.
Yeah, I feel like those were on the rise once this whole superfood like marketing campaign that continues. Maybe not as much as it did maybe like 10 years ago. I had Sally Norton on. I don't know if you know Sally Norton.
Oh, nice. Yeah, she's the one that helped me completely, because nobody else, when you're looking at Google, nobody else gives you the right information. It's always this is low, and the next one says no, that's high. The same food.
Right.
And so she was the one. And so this January, her Toxic Superfoods book came out. Right. Mm-hmm. And so anyhow, I immediately got that and devoured it, because it was such a good read, but good. That's awesome that you had her on your podcast.
Yeah, she was great. I don't know. This was a few months, not too long ago, maybe a few months ago. And yeah, she's on this, crusade of, getting rid of oxalates from our food. And, I don't think you can totally eliminate it. And some people can tolerate it more than others. Some people are very sensitive to it. But yeah, it was great having her on. And then recently, you talk about blood sugar. I just had the one of the main nutritionists and the senior nutrition manager over at NutriSense. So NutriSense is a CGM company, and the continuous glucose monitors. And so we talked all about blood sugar, and it's interesting. Certain foods, and this would be the pro of getting maybe a CGM just to see, maybe just use it for a month, even like a few weeks. I think each of them lasts like 2 weeks, because I don't use one all the time, but using it initially, just understanding how these certain foods affect you, because for some foods might affect you. Maybe, rice doesn't affect you a certain way, but someone else, it might, totally spike it and put you way out of range. And we also talked about too, there's nothing wrong with having a spike in blood sugar as long as it comes back to the norm. When you get an issue, when there's an issue, is where it spikes and it doesn't really come back as much as it should back to the norm. And that's where there could be a real bit of, so almost like that chronic high insulin and high blood sugar is where we get into the issues.
Yeah. And you'll only know that, Brian, if you test, right? That's the only way that people will know what those foods do for you or do to you. And then also if you ever know that you're coming back into the norm. So yeah, I typically, have clients check right away in the morning and see what their fasting is. And we kind of keep a log of that. And then, if they don't have the CGM and they're just doing a finger prick, maybe 1 hour after the breakfast, right? And then 2 hours after, when we really do want it to normalize or come back pretty close to that fasting blood sugar, right? Because if not, we end up having, this chronically high, like you were saying, and totally devastating. I mean, when you look at the diabetes scenario, right? When you look at that with as far as what they deal with physically, the vascular system, the neurological system, I mean, everything just going out the window essentially, because blood sugar is just, you can kind of almost think about it as a hammer, right? I mean, it's just hammering on everything consistently until it can no longer function quite well, right? And so, pretty important to be focused on and get it checked out and understood in your body.
And then you talked about your morning, you talked about your afternoon and what you're eating in the evening. Do you have I just did a small micro podcast on like night routines and sleep routines. What does yours look like?
You know what? We definitely are focused on the low lighting, right? That is something that we're super particular about. We want to, make sure that there's a couple hours of super low lighting. Even when we watch TV, we'll have it on as super dark, where it's sometimes hard. I also have blue blocker glasses. I've done some experimenting with them to see if maybe they were contributing to like headaches that I was dealing with there for a while. I don't think so. I think it probably had a little bit more to do with like histamines. But anyhow, and again, see, here I am, right? Still in, my 40s dealing with gut stuff, right? Histamines, right? Just always trying to figure it out. But anyhow, the, low lighting is a big key, just making sure that you're not overstimulated. I'm not doing my workouts in the nighttime, trying to also get to bed. It's really important that you get to bed before 10 p.m. Those hours of recovery prior to midnight are dramatically huge. And so anyhow, now that of course it's getting darker earlier, it's super easy for me to be in bed, sometime around early 9 o'clock hour. But just trying prior to that to, finish dinner early. So you're not sitting there with a heavy stomach or some kind of extra food. And, kind of the big title of your podcast, right, is to, get lean and, certainly having a big belly of food, right? A large amounts of food as you go to bed is not one of those strategies to get you lean. So making sure supper's done early, turn down the lighting, and, do calming activities, whether it's, breathing, meditation, or, if you do watch a TV, just make sure it's not too overstimulating and it's as dark as you can get that screen, or blue blocker glasses.
Now, you also mentioned, obviously, you got into bodybuilding, natural bodybuilding, and you won, what is it, 2001, was it?
2001, second place, Mr. Idaho.
But you also talked about the fact that when you got into the vegan vegetarian, that you were over exercising. And I think some people are like, can you really over exercise? Maybe touch a little bit about how you can sort of overstress the body and not allow for recovery and how that could be detrimental.
Right. Yeah. You know what? I actually see it in lab results quite often, right? So, when we see somebody's cortisol readings, we can definitely see that, many of them are in the exhaustive phase, and therefore, they've spent, a good amount of time. And it's not the only stressor, right? The exercise is far from the only stressor, but oftentimes you will, even in my situation, you'll find out that somebody has been exercising pretty extensively. We could actually come back, Brian, all the way to, what we've heard about, what we've heard about or studied about of our ancestors, where, it's kind of like this slow, methodical moving of hunting and gathering, right? And then these once in a while sprints and these once in a while lifting of heavy things, right? And so I think that, that makes a lot more sense, because if you were doing right what I was doing, which was, 5 to 6 days a week of heavy lifting, 2 hours, hour at the minimum, right? Hour in the weight room. And then, you go and you do some type of a cardiovascular of 3 to 4 hours of bike riding, maybe on top of that. So you're having somewhere around, 4, 5, 6 hours of exercise a day. And that was easy to do as a personal trainer, because oftentimes the middle of my day wasn't as full of clients as it is morning and night when everybody wants to train, right? So you could certainly do that. But what I've found now, Brian, over exercising is different for everybody, right?
Sure.
But it can basically be just you doing an hour of hardcore every day of the week, just about, or 6 days, 5 days a week, right? There's no area of basically rest in those days. It's just these big, long workouts. So I've found for myself that if I, basically work out, two times a week, pretty heavy on weights, and this is only for like 45 minutes to an hour, and then maybe get in one cardio for like 45 minutes, 35 minutes, something like that, that really pushes my cardiopulmonary. That's it for me. Like I've noticed, all the other stressors that I do, with the cold plunge or sauna, right? That's enough, right? And work, we always have to evaluate that, right? How much work stress, how much everything, family stress do we have? But that's what I find that works good for me, is very minimal. Like that's basically 3 workouts a week of 45 minutes or so, that's enough.
Yeah. And obviously it took you some time to figure that out. And I would imagine that most bodybuilders will say that that's not the healthy way to do things, right? Competing and cutting your weight to your like 4% body fat, that's not obviously sustainable and a healthy living. But you're doing it for competition, and I'm sure like you did it once or twice, or I don't know how many times you competed, and then you sort of I had Robert Sykes on the show from Keto Savage. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's like a keto bodybuilder, but he's got a good podcast, and he's built up a big brand. But as we're doing this podcast, I'm looking out and there's 3 deer running by, which is sort of cool. But anyways,
nice.
Anyway, so but he's showing pictures of himself and the way he looks, and I'm like, wow. I'm like, obviously this is taking a toll, but he's doing this for competition, and that's obviously not the norm. But yeah, I mean, you talk about stressors. I mean, 3 days a week of a workout, I think would be probably an ideal for the normal individual out there, right? I don't think people need to do much more than that. I mean, 3 to 4 at most, like that's about where I lay for my workouts. And because obviously as you get older, Dustin, how old are you?
47.
47. Yeah. I mean, even, recovery is just as important as the actual workout,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I might have just added a year to maybe I'm 46. That crazy how you knew it when you were a kid, but
you're not supposed to add a year when you get old, as you get older.
Isn't that true? Yeah. I should have went back, but anyhow, you're exactly right. Wow. When you get older, it's more difficult, right, to recover. And, even when I was cycling really heavily, a lot of my cycling friends were, older, and I'm talking like, they were in their 60s, and even early 70s, and they were fit, right? And they were healthy and they were cycling, but they all talked about how, like there's no chance that they can go do this day after day after day, like I was doing, because, they just don't have the recovery. They have the desire. They want to be out there in the fresh air and sunshine and back on their bike. Right. But they they just can't recover. So yeah, it definitely gets that way as we get older.
What I mean, it's interesting. I also had Jay Feldman on who's talks about, like, these stressors, they all go in the same bucket, right? Whether you got cut off at the light while you were driving, or did an intense workout, right? These are all contributing to this stress bucket that adds up. And I think people don't realize that, and they do have a tendency to overdo it, like you said you did back in the day. What type of things do you do for a quality recovery to sort of come back so you can be, stronger and have, great workouts?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Real quick on the stressor thing too. One of the things that we look at as FDNs, right, is the internal stressors too. So regardless of who cut you off at the light, or regardless of, how big of a workout you had, right, it's also the fact that you're carrying around, some form of a, liver congestion or gut pathogens, or, blood sugar dysregulation or whatever, right? So those are also things that you don't even take in consideration that are stressing you, going in the same bucket, right? But, as far as recovery goes, one of my favorite things is, doing, rolling on a foam roller, rolling on, lacrosse balls. I've really found that to be probably one of the biggest recovery tools that I can use. Stretching, of course, is great, and I do, a little bit of that, and, try to get, some yoga, and poses and things in. But, yeah, I would say that that's really helpful. The other thing is, I talked about cold plunge and sauna, right? Those are both going to be excellent because of certainly the, the difference in, vascularity as far as contraction and dilating, blood vessels and those kind of things. But probably the biggest thing that we could all do, Brian, is get enough sleep and get to sleep on time, right? And then try to make sure that we're figuring out our blood sugar and so forth, that we actually sleep well. And one of those internal stressors that can keep us up at night that we don't always know about, right, is gut dysbiosis. So whether you have parasites or whether you have, whatever, messing with your gut, oftentimes they're active at night. And so they'll have you waking up, or the traditional Chinese medicine says 1 to 3 a.m. is liver time. So you've got this liver, waking you up or whatever. So we've got to dial in our sleep really well. And sometimes if somebody's got that stuff dialed in, a little bit more, like I've been working on, my whole life. One of the things that helped me big time as to come to sleep is mouth taping. So if you'll get into mouth taping, I mean, it can make just a huge difference. And so that's something that's huge for our recovery, right? Is we want to definitely make sure that we're sleeping well.
And that's to promote, obviously, breathing through your nose, which is like you talk to a lot of people who are like gung ho about that, right? Like I remember I've got into it a little bit. I haven't done it as much lately. I try to breathe through my nose as much as possible. What maybe, I don't, if you're doing that, what are some of the benefits to nasal breathing versus just, people who just breathe through their mouths?
Yeah. I think that if your audience wants the best education on it, James Nestor wrote the book Breathe. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's a really great resource. And he'll go into all of the, big time science and those type of things from just a biohacking standpoint. Right. Is that basically when you are breathing through your mouth, right, you are not going to ultimately have, the quality of sleep. It's kind of like those individuals that, are dealing with sleep apnea, right? That if you're breathing through your mouth, you're just going to be kind of oftentimes maybe gagging or gasping, I guess would be another word, right? Gasping in the middle of the night when you don't even necessarily know it. And all those things are disruptive to your sleep. You're just kind of constantly doing these micro breaks in your sleep. So by keeping that mouth shut, you're going to have more of this consistent sleep. And
it's also a filter, right? I mean, breathing through your nose helps filter out, dust and allergens, can boost your oxygen intake and things like that. And also I've heard that, sort of humidify the air that you breathe in. When you're mouth breathing, there's nothing there. It could sort of dry out your mouth per se. And so.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, one of the things that I really enjoyed about mouth breathing about mouth taping is not waking up and having a dry, sore throat, right? That took a while to get to feeling better just because, you've had your mouth gaping open or whatever. And yeah, I mean, it's good. I mean, there are certainly, some individuals, right, that feel like they, are going to be claustrophobic or whatever. It really isn't too bad. Like you have the control. So the minute you feel like you don't like this, I mean, it's like as quick as just rip that off of your face. It's not that big a deal. And I tried several different brands, Brian, of mouth tape or whatever. I've almost come back to, as long as I maintain a shaved face, right? If I maintain a shaved face, then just regular old medical tape seems to work good, and it's inexpensive. But if I don't, I have to do more of like the lip ones, like the Somnifix.
Mm-hmm.
You may have seen those, and some people may feel a little bit more comfortable with them because they have just a little bit of a slit at the front where you could take in a touch of air through your mouth if you wanted. But I don't know how much of us really do. Once your mouth's taped, it's more about not opening it wide, right, and getting that. But there's lots of different brands, out there, and I encourage people to experiment like I did.
Yeah, no, I forgot about that one. I actually have some, and I have some. I have to get back into it. It's give it a try.
Yeah.
Go and maybe explain to the audience a little bit about what you do, and I know you're a practitioner through FDN, and we've been working together a lot. What are some of the main things that you focus on with clients?
Yeah, they always talk about how you should really, create a niche in what you're probably best at, right? And so I find myself, at a place where, gut and brain health have been my two biggest things that I've been focused on, right? So I definitely like to help clients with getting their gut back to health and their brain back into, all everything it's supposed to be, which is absolutely amazing, as we know. But I'm not limited to that too, Brian. There's so much of looking at, these foundational labs that I require, clients to run, that then I can see this big picture approach of what exactly is going on. And so anyhow, we're as a functional diagnostic practitioner, not here to diagnose, right, or treat or cure. That's not the goal. Instead, I really want to help clients find why their function has been lost, right? We really want to know, if they're having troubles with that sleep that we talked about, as far as really making sure that's dialed in. Well, why is that function lost, right? We should be naturally born and built to sleep well, right? If they're having trouble digesting like I did, or keeping a healthy mood, why has that function been lost, right? So anyhow, it's all about, people getting functional labs done so we can see the loss of function. And then, really looking at that big, picture, and, coming down to, natural solutions to deal with that.
Yeah, I love that. And your website is Serious About Wellness. Love that as well. SeriousAboutWellness.com. And yeah, I mean, I've learned a ton through FDN and sort of identifying whatever stressors may be causing sort of this metabolic chaos. Whether it's hormones, immune, digestion, right, detoxification, energy, or neurological function, and yeah, the work that you're doing with clients is something that you really can't get anywhere else. So I highly recommend it, and yeah, it's been a great learning experience for myself. So is that the best place for people to find you? SeriousAboutWellness.com.
It really is. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. And, Brian, that name came about, right? Because you were saying that you kind of like that. It came about how I really, know that, from my own health journey, right, that it really takes an individual just being serious about their wellness, right?
Yeah.
And so that's really what I want to portray to clients too, is that they, in order to really heal and get everything kind of dialed in back, we've just got to be serious about every aspect. We can't, do the right eating, but then we're still out there over exercising, right? Or we can't stop that over exercising, but now we're not sleeping or whatever. It really requires us to do every bit of it. And so it does take us to becoming very serious about it, not just, kind of whatever happens.
I mean, I always say, if you don't have your health, what do you have? Right. I mean,
right. I mean, it's our by far our biggest asset, right? I mean, if you truly had a whole bunch of money, right, and you don't have your health, I mean, what are you going to do with that money? I mean, you just can't even go out and enjoy it or do anything with it. So it is definitely our biggest asset. And I've known that from a very young age. I mean, this all started back, like I said, very young, but really got into studying at like age 10 or 12 when I started bodybuilding.
And if you were going to give one tip, this is a question I ask most of my guests. If you were going to give one tip to an individual that was looking to get their body or their mind back to what it once was, maybe when they were in their 20s, what one tip would you give that individual?
I seem to say this often, Brian. I would love to come up with a new one maybe, but my favorite would be, just, if nothing else, start out with doing cold showers. At least a couple times a week. And the reason why is, when you had said getting your body and your mind back to, when you're 20s, one of the things that, that cold exposure is going to do is going to oftentimes in individuals help us to seal the brain blood barrier. So oftentimes we can have, this leaky gut that is went up basically and created a leaky brain. We oftentimes know that, and cold exposure actually helps that. But in addition to that, we're going to move lymphatic, right? We're going to ultimately, it's going to be one of the more tool to help you maintain a lean body, right? So yeah, I mean, when we're talking about getting back to maybe what we felt like when our 20s, that would be one of my biggest steps, is at least start there. You don't have to go down to the whole like cold plunge thing necessarily if you don't want to, but at least start getting yourself back into a couple cold showers a week.
Love that. Gets you a little, the thing about it is you can ease into it with showers, and it gets you a little bit out of your comfort zone, which I think we can all use every once in a while. And you definitely don't need any coffee after you do those, right? So
that's right. Yeah. And you can also, I mean, you're in an environment, right, that you can warm yourself right back up. So like you said, it's such a great way to ease into it right away than if you were out, cold plunging at a river or in a lake or something, right? You're not in an environment you can warm yourself back up very quickly. Whereas in the shower, you have that total control. So it's super easy to just get started and just see how you feel, see if it works for you.
Love it. All right, Dustin, I'm glad we got this together. Seriousaboutwellness.com. And I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all the knowledge.
Oh, you bet. Yeah, my pleasure, Brian. Thank you so much for having me.
No, my pleasure. Have a great day.
All right, you do the same.
Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangrin.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again, and have a great day.